Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor Jon V. Kofas is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, this is an analytical session on the historical ties between Russia and Afghanistan. And the focus is really on the dynamics behind rapprochement, the normalization of relations between Russia and the Taliban regime in July 2025, the long-standing relationship of Russia goes back to the 19th century, and it had normal relations as well as hostile relations. And today we're in a situation where both Russia and Afghanistan have mutual interests in a relationship that is based on geopolitical and geoeconomic goals, considering that Russia is the first country to recognize the Taliban regime in the world, although there are other countries, regional, mostly Muslim countries, but also China, that have had trade relations and have, at the ambassadorial level, have had exchanges at that level. Now, let me start by pointing out that foreign policy is a reflection of the country's social contract and its domestic policy. A country's social contract, which is invariably reflected in its constitution, at least at the theoretical level, is supposed to represent all people, although in reality, we have had under the capitalist system in the last 500 years, social contracts based on the political economy of capitalism, and in the last 50 years or so, a little bit less than that, on the neoliberal phase of capitalism. Russia and Afghanistan are not exactly in the core of the neoliberal system, although Russia much more so than certainly Afghanistan, which has been, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, as we'll see. I'll give you some statistics. But back on the issue of foreign policy, the foreign policy of a country, usually governments point out, reflects national interest, national security interest, when in fact, historically, this goes back to the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. The fact is that the foreign policy of a country, whether it's the Persian Empire or today's Russia, and even smaller countries like Afghanistan, reflects much narrower interests of the political class, the hegemony of the political class in society, but also specific groups within that society, namely the elites benefiting from commercial relations with other countries. In the case, for example, of Russia, the beneficiaries of Russia's normalization of relations with Afghanistan and the recognition of the Taliban regime, which is basically an outlaw regime as far as a terrorist regime, as far as many nations are concerned around the world, the beneficiaries of that are companies invariably linked, whether in gas, oil, wheat exports, Um, or infrastructure development, for example, railroad development and so forth, companies that are invariably linked to the Kremlin. The Kremlin oligarchy, because the Kremlin is the catalyst to the Russian oligarchy, is really the beneficiary in terms of tangible benefits um, of the normalization of Russian relations with Afghanistan. Now, as far as Afghanistan, they don't have, they do not have the type of billionaires that the many billionaires that Western countries have, or China. Uh, Afghanistan does have one very notable billionaire, namely Marwas Azizi. Azizi is, as far as I can see, the only multi-billionaire, the wealthiest person in Afghanistan. In fact, the total wealth of his companies is 3 times larger than the GDP of Afghanistan. Azizi is based in Dubai, has international investments, Dubai-based operations, but actually he does have Russian, actually Soviet roots. He started out making money during the Soviet era in the tobacco industry, and then he went into development, that is property development, as well as banking, and then branched out operations, and is a very important person in the Afghan society. He claims, of course, to be doing everything, as usually billionaires and multimillionaires do, presenting themselves as philanthropists. Uh, Never mind the reality of amassing all that wealth, even in countries like Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the world. He does present himself as a savior of society, and his only goal is to save Afghanistan, of course, and not to make money, because he makes money overseas, in Dubai and other places. Anyway, in August 2021, the Taliban regime took over, and 4 years later, roughly almost 4 years later, the Kremlin, Russia, Vladimir Putin as the president, became the first country to recognize officially the Taliban regime and to strike some deals. They had already signed some deals, as we'll see, but to strike more deals for trade relations. The question is, of course, why did Putin do this? And we'll talk about this more, because it is for geo-economic and geopolitical interests, especially considering that Vladimir Putin has been at war against his neighbor Ukraine, and his ultimate goal is to make sure that Ukraine stays NATO-free, is as free of Western military and economic integration as possible. And he needs allies in Eurasia and Asia. And Afghanistan provided an opportunity for Vladimir Putin when the United States, after 20 years of military occupation and efforts to install a puppet regime in Kabul, in Afghanistan, failed. And this is where the opportunity came in, and he's trying to fill a power gap, as we say in diplomatic lingo. In other words, he saw an opening, considering, again, I remind you that Afghanistan is internationally isolated, informal relations in trade, and even with the United States, the Afghans argue that they're open for business. The Taliban, rather, it's open for business. So obviously they want legitimacy. So the quest for legitimacy is the leverage, is the weak point, and the leverage that Putin used to make inroads and to get in there and secure as many allies in Afghanistan, such as it is, because this is a country that's very poor and weak. There are 20 ethnic groups in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is multi-ethnic. led by the Pashtuns, the majority, the Tajiks and the Hazaras, but there are other groups. They, however, although they're ethnically heterogeneous, Afghanistan is ethnically heterogeneous in what some sociologists call a case of tribalism. They are religiously homogeneous. Almost all are Muslims. The unfortunate thing is that this country is one of the poorest in the world, the least developed in the world, according to the United Nations. When the United Nations looks at metrics on economic and social development, it ranks very low among the 195 countries in the world. Afghanistan ranks very low. It is a country whose economy to this day, this is the 21st century, 2025, is stuck back in the medieval era because it's primarily based on the agricultural sector and the mining sector, the primary sector of production. The primary sector of production is forestry, fisheries, mining, animal husbandry, and farming. And that now they do have they do have arts and crafts industries and small shops and so forth. But nothing really, there is no secondary, there's no manufacturing, in other words, no manufacturing sector comparable, let's say, to that of its neighbor, Iran. By the way, Afghanistan's neighbors, with the exception of China, are all Muslims and Muslim countries, and Iran is one of those. And so Afghanistan is surrounded by Muslim countries, with the exception of China. The contradiction with this country is, and this is what the Russians are trying to do here, Vladimir Putin, of course, is that it is rich in natural resources. China knows this. China has been trying to integrate Afghanistan. In fact, I had argued years ago in an article that I published that China was actually the main economic beneficiary, and in some respects geopolitical, not just economic beneficiary, of the US invasion and military occupation of Afghanistan. Now, obviously, geography plays a role in the dynamics of foreign policy. In the 19th century, the late 19th century, the president of Mexico, an authoritarian figure, Porfirio Diaz, used to say, Mexico is so close to the United States, so far from God. Well, the fact is that Afghanistan is what it is, and then one of the neighbors happens to be the world's richest countries measured in purchasing power parity GDP. That's China. And China has been trying for a long time now, all along, as the United States was occupying and engaging Afghanistan militarily, has been trying to get in there and preparing itself for what happens after the American troops leave. And it is one of the players, and as we'll see. Now, this is a country not only rich in mineral resources, including, by the way, zinc, lithium, iron, copper, gold, a lot of mineral resources, but in rare earth minerals, very, very important, because China has most of those, by the way. All right, this is the leverage they have over the West, especially the United States, in tariffs that the Trump administration has been trying to impose. They have rare earth elements which are important to the high-tech industry and to the defense sector. Afghanistan is one of these countries that has a lot of those, as does Russia and Ukraine. And Russia's interest is certainly in that, as is China's. Now, the interesting thing is that despite rich land, poor people. In fact, it is estimated that 70% of the population in Afghanistan now, some argue that this is the result of the US military engagement, US, I shouldn't say US/NATO military engagement from 2001 to 2021, that 20-year period, which really devastated Afghanistan, and it just crippled the economy, social and economic development. So we have 70% of the population in poverty, and 60% of that 70% of the general population are children. Afghanistan, of course, on top of that, unfortunately, historically, unfortunately, in many senses of the word, Afghanistan has been an opium producer. The Taliban in the 1990s, as we'll see, tried to do away as much as they could of the opium industry. And then Afghanistan became, once again, during the era of the US military occupation, a major opium producer and exporter. Opium, of course, being a very lucrative product. So but the result of this, when you look at, it's not just that they sold globally, and of course the buyers were mostly Western, although obviously buyers from Iran to Turkey, in other words, regional buyers as well. When you look, however, at the military occupation, US military occupation, it devastated young people who got hooked into opium as well. Now, the Taliban goal in the rapprochement with Russia, which has been for some time during right after the United States left. By the way, just for the record, the Kremlin did approve of US invasion of Afghanistan. It did approve of it. The Kremlin has been historically anxious, shall we say, concerned about the issue of jihadists, because the fact is the Russian Federation, although predominantly Christian, Orthodox, and Catholics, it also has a Muslim population, but it is surrounded. A lot of the former republics, Soviet republics, including those bordering Afghanistan, are Muslim. So it has had a sense of uneasiness about jihadist activity. And of course, Russia was involved in Syria in the previous decade, in the 2010s, to crush the ISIS jihadists in Syria. And so it has had a very uneasy view about jihadists destabilizing Russia and their allies and their neighbors. Now, the Taliban have been interested in strengthening an economy that's in ruins. This is an economy that is very weak. Its GDP is one of the lowest in the world at 17 to 20 billion, depending what statistics you see. Like I said, Azizi, the only billionaire, as far as I can determine, that Afghanistan has, who lives mostly in Dubai, has more money. The net worth, not that he personally, the net worth of his companies is estimated at least 3 times higher than the GDP of this entire country. So this gives you an idea. it is indeed a country that needs economic development, and by all metrics, in other words, in terms of infrastructure. Let's look at the metrics that the United Nations looks at. Infrastructure, roads, railroads, and this is an area, by the way, that the Russians are interested in. They want to go in there. Not that China is not, because China, by the way, has included Afghanistan. It's in Belt and Road Initiative program, that is the global infrastructure program intended to integrate as many countries, beginning with Asia and Eurasia, and then branching out to the rest of the world, like Latin America and Africa. So you have basically infrastructural development that's in dire need. Obviously, the U.S. was in there bombing for 20 years, but even before that, this Afghanistan wasn't France by any stretch of the imagination, even before the U.S. went in. So there's schools, there are hospitals, there are clinics that they need. They need to have a system, an infrastructural development system that includes a social safety net, in other words, for their people, 42 million people, who are the vast majority, 3/4 almost, at or below poverty. So the Taliban, and I have listened to videotapes of some officials, of Taliban officials, and they sound pragmatic and matter of fact, that they want to move ahead with this, and as long as not too much is asked of them, unrealistic. They're very touchy about any issue of religious law and becoming more secular, for example, and we'll talk more about that. Now, I do want to talk a little bit more about Russia, though, and what its aims have been, and will be as we move forward toward Afghanistan. Because what is Russia gaining out of this? Russia is a very different country than Afghanistan. Unlike Afghanistan, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, ranks very low in social economic development in the world, sort of not just a third world, sort of what we used to call, before the term global south became popular, fourth world country. Russia has a GDP measured in purchasing power parity that's really ranks fourth in the world. Now, this is in purchasing power parity, not in nominal value, which brings it down much lower. Okay, it has 146 million. Like Afghanistan, it's multi-ethnic, but it has a lot more ethnic minorities, close to 170, 180, somewhere in that neighborhood. So a lot more ethnically diverse. However, the majority are Christian Orthodox. Historically, that's part of the Byzantine Empire's legacy to the Russian Empire, especially under the Romanovs. So you have basically a country that is economically much higher, although historically Russia spent an enormous, and it continues to do this, by the way, to this day, given the war that it's engaged in right now, and has since 2022 with Ukraine. Historically, a sort of quasi-war economy, heavily investing in defense. Not nearly as much as the United States, let me point out, or China, but the United States, of course, leading the world in defense spending. But given that it has a much weaker middle class and a much weaker civilian economy, inordinate Russian military spending here, Afghanistan is in the position that it is because it was tribal, it was engaged in warfare, it had a history of external intervention, as we'll see, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But Russia's goal has been, with regard to Afghanistan, to get in there and to be a player in Afghanistan and determine the regional balance of power. That is one of the aims of Russian diplomacy under Vladimir Putin. And he needs this, especially now, given that the worldview of Vladimir Putin, by the way, Vladimir Putin in scholarly literature has been compared to Peter the Great, and in his own mind, I'm sure he envisions himself like that. Peter the Great in the 17th century, during the age of science, tried to modernize Russia, but with a heavy emphasis on the defense sector, on the glory of Russia through military adventures, through a strong military, not so much the civilian economy. But Peter the Great was astute enough, by the way, although he wasn't hardly a scholar, but he was astute enough to make the connection between a strong civilian economy and a strong defense sector. If you don't have a strong civilian economy, unfortunately, some modern political heads of politicians and heads of state haven't made that connection that Peter the Great made over 300 years ago. That unless you have a strong civilian sector, a strong economy, it's very unlikely that there will be sustained strength in the defense sector. Putin envisions himself somewhat like a Peter the Great. He has a lot of money. Nobody really knows exactly how much money he has. But his ambition is really glory, to go down in history as either Peter the Great, or sometimes he has been compared, by the way, with Joseph Stalin, who I don't know why would anyone want to be compared with Joseph Stalin, but so he envisions himself as this powerful head of state, but realist in pragmatic, Bismarckian style diplomacy, realpolitik, in other words, 19th century German diplomacy, which is, the Taliban is in power, we deal with the Taliban. And that's his approach with that. And the goal here is to use his Asian and Eurasian, the alliances and alignments to prevent the expansion of NATO, because it is no secret that the United States and NATO want to expand east, and they want to expand into Eurasia and Asia, and that's what the Ukraine war is all about, by the way. Putin wants to stop them, and they want to move east. They want to move east through the Transcaucasus region into the Black Sea states, and then they're going to move into Central Asia. And so Putin is positioned, and so does China, by the way. One reason that the Chinese foreign ministry even recently stated there's no way we will accept a Russian defeat in the Ukrainian war. Because what they're really saying is there's no way we're going to accept NATO expansion into Eurasia and Asia, because they know they don't want them as a counterforce on their border. It's that simple. So that and this is one reason, by the way, that Beijing, President Xi Jinping, has not discouraged, on the contrary, publicly, the foreign ministry of China has encouraged the Kremlin to go ahead, pursue rapprochement with Kabul, with the Taliban regime, cultivate closer ties with. So in this deep alliance, the Sino-Russia alliance, the China-Russia alliance, and consolidating power in the Eurasian theater of operations to repel NATO, Putin knows he can do it, and that's what he has pursued. Russia is, for its part, by the way, Kabul, the government in Kabul, the Taliban regime in Kabul, is interested in using the Russian recognition, official recognition of the Taliban regime. It gains legitimacy. Nobody has given it legitimacy so far. Russia is the first one in the world. They figure legitimacy from Russia. Major power, let's face it, they have more nuclear warheads than any country on this planet. And like I said, in terms of PPP, fourth in the world in GDP. Okay, so the Taliban are looking to gain. They figure from there, other countries will follow suit. They won't be as shy to formalize ties with Kabul. They also have repeatedly stated that they want the $9.5 billion that the United States government, the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury Department, has frozen from the Afghanistan Central Bank. That's their money they wanted. Now, their whole GDP is roughly, depending whose figures you believe, it's roughly twice that. And half of that amount, half of the GDP, approximately half of the amount of the GDP, are the frozen assets of the Afghanistan Central Bank by the Treasury Department. They want it back. Without strings attached. The strings attached are the United States from the Biden administration, by the way, which pulled out of this country after. By the way, it was realistic. Obama was going to do it. He never did. Biden finally made the step of pulling out of there. And then from Obama to Biden to Trump, they are not exactly friendly toward Afghanistan. This is the country that hosted Al-Qaeda. This is the country that where jihadists were hiding out. Now, why is it that Afghanistan hosted jihadists, and how did jihadists, even the Taliban, how did it evolve? Well, when you look at the history of Afghanistan, what you have in this landlocked country surrounded by mostly Muslim countries, all of them are Muslim except China, is a history of foreign invasions. Going back from the Persian Empire to Alexander the Great, the Macedonian, to Mongols, and then in the 19th century, the Romanov dynasty, the Russian Empire, was involved in an imperialist rivalry with the British Empire, the Great Game, as it was called. The fact is that the Russians were interested in expanding into Iran and then into Afghanistan because the Romanov dynasty from the 16th century onwards had a policy of internal colonialism, that is expanding from one from the Pacific, basically internally colonizing all that land. Internal colonialism was part of their policy. However, they were also interested, and this makes sense in terms of, you can see historical continuity from the Romanov period, and there are many scholarly books and articles on this issue, by the way. You can see the historical continuity of Russian obsession with securing not just consolidating power inside what is now the Russian Federation, but also the areas that are around Russia, all the states that are around Russia, which include, of course, all the former Soviet republics. And in the 19th century, it included, of course, branching out into Iran And the Russians did sign a treaty in 1813 where Moscow gained territory at the expense of Iran. That's where the interest with Afghanistan entered the picture. The interest with Afghanistan entered the picture in the early 19th century, and the clash with England came when England in 1838 went to war against China. It's called the First Opium War. And it's called the First Opium War because the goal of England was to force China to buy opium from the English East India Company. Opium they were getting from northern India and Burma to sell it to China, with which, by the way, England had a trade deficit, and they were going to sell them opium so they can realize the surplus. So this is when the clash, this is, of course, the beginning of the great game. In other words, clash of imperialist goals, Russian imperialism versus English imperialism, just as today there is a clash of imperialism on a world scale. Russia expanding into Afghanistan, okay, through diplomacy, through trade, and so forth, but still looking at Afghanistan as a buffer zone, as a counter to prevent the West from ending there to make that Eurasia and Asia stays under the Russo-China, the Russian-China axis, if you will, if we are permitted to use this term. The great game lasted throughout the 19th century. In 1885, Russia took land near the Kushk River, which is on the border of Turkmenistan, which borders Afghanistan. And there was a clash there. And the British again reacted to that. And this continued until 1907, when Britain ultimately prevailed. Russia had weakened considerably by 1907. It had lost the war to Japan in 1904, 1905, the Russo-Japanese War over China, over Manchuria, called Manchukuo, of course. They had lost that war. Russia was weakened. The Romanov dynasty was considerably weak. So by 1907, the great game was effectively over. When Vladimir Lenin took over with Leon Trotsky during the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Afghanistan, Lenin had a policy of recognizing the national sovereignty of countries, not pursuing imperialism. Lenin was against, influenced profoundly by Rosa Luxemburg in the early 20th century, in the late 19th, early 20th century. He was totally against imperialism and recognized the legitimacy of Afghanistan. So Russia, the Soviet Union, at least during the Lenin period, did not have any ambitions toward Afghanistan. The Afghanistan was evolved shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. It gained quasi-independence in 1921. Okay, and sort of autonomy. However, it was invariably linked to the West, especially the British Empire. India was still, this is before the era of Mahatma Gandhi in the 1940s, India was still a colony. So the British continued on the course of imperialism. And Afghanistan was a global South, politically, economically, militarily dependent on externally on the West. Okay, so it remained I don't want to use the term puppet, but a regime that was dependent on the West, let's put it that way. And the regime that evolved was a monarchy under Mohammed Shah after 1943 especially, and it remained so until 1973, when there was a military coup and a republic was established in Afghanistan. The republic remained Western, although there was no longer a monarchy. The Shah was gone. The republic remained pro-West, pro-US. However, in April 1978, there was in Afghanistan the so-called April Revolution. And the April Revolution brought into power a left-wing regime with close links to Moscow. This was a time when the Soviet Union was still in existence. Immediately, the United States and Britain, both the United Kingdom and the US, wanted to topple the pro-Soviet regime starting in 1978, and because in the following year, 1979, when there was the invasion, of course, of the Soviet Union, that's how the West sees it, invasion. The Soviets argue this was assistance to the regime, to the pro-Soviet regime. In 1979, there was the Iranian Revolution. So the West was looking at Iran, Afghanistan, two neighboring countries lost to the Western spheres of influence, So the CIA, as well as the British intelligence services, were in the business of military intelligence, were in the business of training the Mujahideen, jihadists, against the Kabul regime, which was leftist. Let me just say a word or two about the regime from 79 to 89, which was left-wing. It was secular. They wanted separation of church and state. They wanted observance of human rights. They wanted women to achieve a modicum of equality with men. Okay, they wanted westernization of Afghanistan. They wanted a country to be modernized socially and economically, to catch up with the West, because it had been stuck in the medieval era. These are what the goals were. However, the CIA and the British intelligence, okay, with support from Saudi Arabia, by the way, undermined, sabotaged the regime. They were helping for a decade the Mujahideen, the jihadist rebels in the mountains, fight the Soviets who were in there helping the regimes stay in power. Now, the 1980s was a very curious decade for the Soviet Union. The curious decade was Mikhail Gorbachev comes in and he sees the mess that the Soviet economy is in, the civilian economy, and the reality that the Soviet Union was spending inordinate amounts of money on foreign military aid and foreign economic aid, and engaged in a war in Afghanistan, because it was a war. The fact is, they were bullets exchanged between the Mujahideen and the Soviet troops. And Mikhail Gorbachev saw the bleeding of the civilian economy through the military expenditures, which, by the way, because the Soviets always fudge those numbers, you never know exactly how much they were spending. But they were spending a lot. This is very good. They were helping, during the Vietnam War, they were helping Vietnam. They were sending a lot of aid to Cuba, by the way. So they were involved in Africa. there was a lot of Soviet aid to regimes that they deemed friendly. Afghanistan was one of those drains. Now, throughout that decade, again, though, let's remember, this is the only regime that attempted to provide separation of church and state, secularization of society, modernization, social development, equal rights for women, okay, and human rights, considering there are more than 20 groups, ethnically diverse society in Afghanistan. Okay, let's keep that in mind. By 1989, the Kremlin had seen enough, they withdrew. It was obvious by 1989 the Soviet bloc was probably not going to make it itself, not just the Soviet Union. So there was no point keeping the troops in Afghanistan. So they let it go. This meant that the jihadist rebels, the Mujahideen, which were not as homogeneous, because a branch of these Mujahideen became the Taliban. This faction, supported again by Western intelligence and military services, okay, trained by them militarily, this is the faction that then slowly came to power. They took power in the 1990s, and it turns out they were as anti-Western as the Iranian government of Ayatollah Khomeini after he took power in 1979. So just because they were Muslims, in other words, religious political leaders, does not mean, in other words, conservative, does not mean that they were pro-West. They were not pro-Soviet, that was the enemy, but they were not pro-West either. But the Taliban did bring back, they were reactionary. They went back to the medieval traditions and wanted to wipe out all traces of secularism of the 1980s of the pro-communist, pro-Soviet regime, all traces of equality for women, all traces of, like I said, of modernization and social safety net, which they regarded as modeling after the West. The Taliban by 1996 had control of the entire country. And they enjoyed that control for 5 years until terrorist attack in New York primarily, but a few other, Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania, in the United States by Al-Qaeda. And then the United States decided to pursue Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and to also demand that Pakistan make itself the base of operations for the United States military to attack Afghanistan. So in 2001 begins a 20-year tragedy, military adventure, which cost more than 176,000 dead Afghans. It is difficult to estimate the injured, and of course, several million displaced people. During that period, the economy was devastated of Afghanistan. Opium became once again a major product for domestic use and export. The opium trade skyrocketed under US military occupation. And the question is, what were the aims of the United States? Where was the United States going with all of this for 20 years? To do what with Afghanistan? Afghanistan had a history of military interventions from the Persian Empire and Alexander the Great to the Romanov monarchs, the Tsars in the 19th century, the British hitting Afghanistan from neighboring India, by the way, I forgot to mention that. None of them succeeded. None of them succeeded. Where was the US going? What was it going to do with Afghanistan? Deny this piece of real estate, as President Lyndon Johnson used to say about Vietnam. We're not in the business of denying this real estate in Vietnam and Southeast Asia to the other side, namely to the communists, to the communists in China or in Russia. We're just trying to assert the long-standing status of the United States. Well, it was really about the long-standing status of the United States. This was the early 20th century, the 21st century, sorry. In other words, it was in the 2000s, the George W. Bush administration. The US spent at least $2.3 trillion on Afghanistan. And the question is, why? What did it gain? When in fact, you look at the balance sheet, as I stated earlier, economically, at the end of all this, it was indeed China that derived the economic benefits of integration, because China is right there, and China just waited out, just like China does with a lot of US military engagements. Because China, by the way, the Chinese elites, this is just parenthetically, the Chinese political elite, the political elites and the business elites, the intelligentsia, especially the Chinese intelligence, they have this assumption that the US, you don't need to do much with the US. They just pursue policies that for some reason that are self-destructive, that you just wait it out. So they have this view that there's not much need to be that interventionist. Just wait it out, and it will fail. And they have been proved, unfortunately for the United States, of course, they have been proved right, by the way, that you wait it out, and no one will call what happened in Afghanistan an American success. No one. And the idea that there was a military solution for some reason, and again, even if the U.S., let's say, managed to install some person like Hamid Karzai that they had put in there, some puppet regime, in other words, in Afghanistan, for how sustainable would that be, and what would they do with that? Considering, again, look at the geography of Afghanistan, look at who is to the north. One of the countries is China. Then you have Pakistan to the south. You have Iran. They're surrounded by Islamic countries and China. What would the US do right in there? Landlocked, by the way. The Indian Ocean, you got to go down, you got to go south. It's landlocked. So the idea of using Afghanistan as a counterweight to Iran, the Israeli approach to balance of power politics in the Middle East, the Lebensraum Israeli approach, is absurd, because the proof is in the failure itself. In any case, by 2021, the Taliban was back in power. So after all that, by the way, I forgot to mention, 67,000 Pakistanis were also killed, not just Afghans. Pakistan was dragged into this. Pakistan was also a victim in this war, which some people, by the way, that's another point I forgot. Some scholars maintain this is also part of that great game. It's right back. that 19th century war of imperialism model is right back in the 21st century. And the result is just as disastrous, first and foremost for the native people, for the Afghan people, neighboring Pakistan, which suffered the devastation of U.S. military presence right there. There were no winners here. This was futile. I shouldn't say there were winners. Western and U.S. companies, some local companies also, by the way, linked to the military-industrial complex, they made money. Nobody else made money. They made money. But the question is, does society exist in order to enrich the pockets of the military-industrial complex of any country, just not whether it's Russia or the United States, it doesn't matter, at the cost of mass destruction? Is that civilization? Is that the new definition of civilization? This is a very important, it's not just a philosophical issue, it's a real issue, because there are wars right now, one in Ukraine, the other in the Middle East, in Israel, that Israel is carrying out against the people of Gaza. So this is a real question. Is that the purpose of civilization? Mass destruction, so a few companies can make higher profits. Russia emerged as one of the winners. Clearly, China did out of all this, but Russia emerged as one of the winners and immediately began to invite, by the way, the Afghan delegations to come to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and began with luring them with trade. In fact, in just a year after the Taliban took over, the Kremlin convinced them, they signed a deal for gas, oil, and wheat. Again, companies, state-owned companies, and also companies linked to Kremlin oligarchs, Kremlin-linked oligarchs benefited from these contracts, and that went to Afghanistan. Russia also was from 2022 and 2020 to 2024 began to look at signing major deals on a railway system, the Chabahar-Zahedan railway system extending from Russia to Iran to Afghanistan. Their ultimate goal was to reach the Indian Ocean through Pakistan. So the goal of Russia was geopolitical and geoeconomic. They were using trade and economic development of Afghanistan because they had their own geopolitical considerations. They also were interested in connecting the infrastructure of road system of Afghanistan through Iran, Uzbekistan, and of course, this would be another link. All of this, by the way, China had no problem with, because China, remember, is part of Afghanistan, rather, is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China global infrastructure development program. So the goal of Russia was economic integration with geopolitical roles. Now, Russia is not China. Let me make that clear. Historically, from the Romanov era to the Soviet era to today, to Vladimir Putin's Russia, Russia has been more heavily tilted toward geopolitical considerations in its foreign policy than China, which is interested more in geoeconomic. China's focus is to spend just enough on the defense sector to make sure that they're not that their geoeconomic interests are not threatened, and that the containment policy of their enemies, namely the West, is that they're able to defend against that. So, so Russia doesn't have the same approach to foreign affairs that China. China has a very heavy emphasis on geoeconomic goals, achieving geoeconomic goals, global economic integration. Okay, the geopolitical stuff is secondary there to support the geoeconomic, and that's not the way. Russia is more like the U.S. I guess in that respect. Anyway, Moscow's recognition of the Taliban this year in 2025 was a very big deal for the Taliban government. The Taliban government has modified the rhetoric, at least the people that they put out in front, by the way, to go on Western television and so forth. They are asking, they're saying they're open for business, even the US, of course, and there are US companies interested. Obviously, a country with enormous untapped potential in the mining sector, most importantly, rare earth minerals, which are vital to defense and to high tech. The question, of course, is where is all of this headed? Let me conclude with this. Where is all this headed with Afghanistan? Afghanistan's future is not with the West. Afghanistan is a landlocked country surrounded by Muslim countries and China to the northeast. And it is inevitable that it would be geography, like Porfirio Diaz, the Mexican president in the late 19th, early 20th century said. Geography determines your fate in many respects, especially if you're a country that's weak. And Afghanistan is, even the Taliban are Muslims who are, I guess, more dogmatic than the average Muslim, but they are not unrealistic. They're pragmatic. They know that their fate, the fate of this country, rests with Eurasia and Asia. It rests with Russia and China as the big entities. They also, by the way, have cordial relations. They, at the commercial level, with India. I forgot to mention India. In other words, they pursue cordial relations with the Gulf states, with Pakistan, with India, with Turkey. So they are trying to, as a country that's so weak, they're trying to pursue multilateral relations because that gives them as much leverage as they can get. They recognize also the pitfalls in having Russia now as the first country. The pitfalls is that Russia is not exactly a country that the West loves. They recognize what that means. However, they have made, like I said, they have made efforts for rapprochement with the United States. They want the close to $10 billion that the US has confiscated, has frozen. They want that back. And they argue that doesn't belong to the Taliban. It belongs to the people of Afghanistan because it's money that the central bank had. That money belongs to the Central Bank of Afghanistan. That's their argument. Okay. Now they also argue that they cannot and will not give back the military hardware the U.S. left behind, estimated in the billions. I don't know. I haven't seen figures. It doesn't matter, but it's estimated. They left it behind. Their argument is that Afghanistan did not invade Omaha, Nebraska. They invaded Afghanistan. They left that military hardware behind because they were invaders and they left behind mass destruction. That military hardware is not going to be part of the bargaining chip for the money that they must release to the central bank. Now, I believe that they will put it up as a bargaining chip. They will eventually, if there is a lucrative deal that perhaps President Trump, he's the ultimate deal maker, art of the deal president, he may come up with some kind of, and he may be able to get some of, I don't know what they would do with that military hardware anyway. That is the US. What would they do with it? I'm sure the defense sector doesn't want it. They want it left back there so they can make new. They can have the more money allocated, civilian taxpayer money, of course, allocated for defense spending. In any case, the fate of this country is with Asia and Eurasia. It is with Russia and with China. So what happened? And China, by the way, gave its blessing to what Russia did. One last point. The U.S. argued, by the way, that the State Department issued a statement that they were adamantly against the Russian recognition of Afghanistan because of the Taliban government has a bad on two counts: human rights and women, the role of women. Let's face it, the Taliban regime is not Norway. It's not Sweden. Okay? It's not Finland. This is a regime that does not have a good human rights record and does not have a good record on women. In the 1980s, when there was a regime that tried to address those issues, the US, the UK, and Saudi Arabia together fought against that regime to make sure they helped to topple that regime. First, that's the first issue. The second issue, the US doesn't raise the issue of women and human rights when it comes to the Palestinian people or to the women and human rights in the Gulf states, only cherry picking Afghanistan because it serves US foreign policy goals. Well, that kind of hollow rhetoric doesn't convince a lot of people. When you have a war in Gaza against civilians and the victims are primarily women and children, and there is no outcry for them, okay? But then they're concerned about the Afghan women, but not the Palestinian. Aren't the Palestinians women? Aren't those women just as precious human beings? Anyway, I want to thank you for tuning in. Write questions, comments, ask questions, write comments. And by all means, join this channel. We'll have more sessions. Thank you very much. Thank you.